In the second part of today's programme, and in the light of the recent reported drop in visitor figures and the dispute about them between government departments and those in the hospitality industry, we'll take a look back at how the Victorians handled such a problem and also the facilities they provided for the tourists, some of which we enjoy today. To tell us more and also to discuss the conservation and registration of properties, we shall be joined by Peter Kelly, MBE of the Isle of Man Victorian Society. But first to health matters. Just before Easter, on the 18th of March, the Minister for Health and Social Care, MHK David Ashford, was our studio guest, and we discussed a range of issues related to the health service. At that time he said that ahead of the just commissioned review on health and social care, the response to the recent public consultation and a variety of actions to be taken would be made soon. Well, it's turned out to be very soon. As Harold Wilson said, a week is a short time in politics. The National Health and Care Service General Scheme 2018 has been published, all 52 pages of it, and it'll come before Tynwald for approval on the 17th of April. As you can imagine, it contains a wide range of provisions, including new proposals to replace or amend the previous controversial plans for charges for prescriptions, ophthalmic services, dental services and exceptions, and much more, alongside a healthcare charter. The Minister couldn't be with us today for a return visit, but earlier in the week, our producer Catherine Nicholl met up with him to discover more about the provisions of this scheme. She started by asking him if his views had changed on the issue since being appointed to the role of the DHSC Minister.
Actually, my views haven't changed. In fact, what we're coming forward with is in line with the views that I expressed as a backbencher. I'm happy to say again, I thought what was originally put out to public consultation from my point of view was unacceptable, that we were going to take a hatchet to all the exemptions, that we were going to turn around and say that the age you receive free prescriptions would match with when you got a free TV licence, which I think is one of the most bizarre things I've ever heard said in Tynwald. And that has now all gone.
Now we'll start with prescription charges. They were probably the most controversial aspect of the consultation and certainly the one that got the most publicity. They're going up from £3.85 to £5 under these proposals. Is that a fair amount? I mean, I know you've been accused of saying in Tynwald that you wouldn't do that.
I want to put that right. I didn't actually say that in Tynwald. I've seen the news articles that say David Ashford said when he was a backbencher and also when he became minister he wouldn't increase prescription charges. What I said in Tynwald was I wasn't willing to proceed with the scheme as was. And this was the scheme of the consultation, which referred to things such as taking, like we've already just mentioned, a hatchet to all the exemptions, to saying you don't get free prescriptions until the age of 75. I pulled the plug on that. That was one of my first acts as ministers. But I've never at any point turned round and said, either in Tynwald, outside of Tynwald or anywhere, that the prescription charges weren't necessarily going to rise. But I think it is a fair amount. Because when you look at what's being charged, for instance, in England, where they're now going to be paying £8.80, and also the fact that we have kept all the exemptions that were there previously in terms of medical conditions. So people with diabetes, people with chronic conditions will still get their prescriptions free. And that is absolutely crucial, because that was something that I was absolutely against in the original consultation, which was the amount of exemptions that were just going to disappear. So 90% of prescriptions that are issued will still remain free.
Although there is always an argument to say that, although you cite England as being significantly higher at £8.80, prescriptions are free in Scotland. So there's a massive difference there.
There is, but of course one thing I should point out about the Scottish model is it's not without controversy. In fact, in 2016, a group of doctors put down a motion to the British Medical Association conference in Scotland calling for an end to free prescriptions because they said it was basically divesting the Scottish NHS of much needed funding. So it's certainly not without controversy. Wales, of course, also has free prescriptions currently, and there's been queries in political circles about whether it's actually having any benefit. And certainly in terms of the Department of Health here, I think it would be very imprudent. It'd be very popular, I'm sure, if I turned around today and said, we're going to move to free prescriptions, but at a time when budgets are under pressure, I've just gone to Tynwald for a supplementary vote, which was my first act as minister, not the way you want to start, but there we go. And all my colleagues are saying, well, you've got pressures, have you got enough money? It would be absolutely bizarre for me as minister to stand up, no matter how popular it would be, and say, well, what I've decided is my first act of the new financial year is we're going to cut off an income stream to the department. That would be absolutely ludicrous.
With that as the backdrop then, is £5 high enough?
I think £5 is a fair rate. Obviously, I've expressed views in the past that I think longer term we need to move to a proper means-tested system, but that still needs to be designed. In the interim, I think £5 is a fair amount, because what you don't want to do is to go too high. And I think that the amount, we've got to keep it affordable for people, particularly in middle income brackets that might not fall into any of the exemptions lists. One other thing I should point out, just in relation to this, because I know there's been a few people on social media I've seen saying, oh, another one of these charges government bumps up every year. Prescription charges, the last time they actually went up was the 1st of September 2010. So it's been 7.5 years since the prescription charge last rose.
But if this is approved by Tynwald, the scheme itself will be reviewed on an annual basis, so you will have the ability to increase charges year on year if you so wish or deem it fit to do so.
There's always been the ability to increase prescription charges year on year. It used to be done via regulations that used to be laid to the floor of Tynwald. But over the last 7.5 years, the decision's been made to leave it at the £3.85. So, and in the future, we'll obviously look at where we want to go, but I think £5 is a fair amount, particularly when you take it in the context that prescription charges have not been affected in any way in the last 7.5 years.
Now, you mentioned the exemptions, and the exemptions that within the consultation would have been removed. You disagreed with the majority of them, and you're not proceeding with those. But there is one change, and that relates to age.
There is. One of the exemptions previously had the age exemption set at 60. The decision's been taken that should be in line with retirement age. In fact, something I said in response in Tynwald when I asked the question about why it was being linked at 75, and I got the answer back saying 75 because that's when you get a free TV licence. I made clear at the time in my supplementary question, wouldn't it be a better idea to link it to retirement age? So that's exactly what we've done. And as the retirement age obviously rises, so will the age of that exemption.
Now, if we move on to dental charges, they're also going up. The three bands are increasing from 1850 to 2060, 5050 to 5630, and 219 to £244.30. But again, like prescriptions, they're lower than those charged in England. Again, we have had a problem in the past, and we seem to have a problem at the moment with contracting NHS dentists to carry out work. Are you charging enough there? Is there enough coming back into the department for you to be able to pay dentists enough to do the work at a reduced rate compared to the private rates?
I think what's important with any of these things is you don't go too far, too quick. And I think if we suddenly upped all the rates, yes, you might suddenly have a lot of people clambering for NHS work, but you've got to make sure that you are providing the right care in the right arena and that the charges aren't excessive. I think the charges, again, that we've come forward with are fair. I think they will deliver the service. I think with dentistry it's more fundamental than just around charges, and I think we've had a chat about this in the past. It's about the way that funding is allocated via the units of dental treatment, and that's something that I've said before I'm very keen to look at, and the way that we engage with the providers of the service and the people who deliver it. And how they deliver it to their patients. I think that is the key to it, not necessarily around the charges. I think the charges that are in the scheme are fair, and I think they are at the right amount.
There is an argument to say that whatever the charges are, and they're at a subsidised rate compared to that in the private sector, if you don't have enough dentists and people are on waiting lists and are not getting dental treatment, they're either going to suffer in silence without getting any treatment, or they're going to have to pay the private sector rates anyway. So no matter what your charges are set at, if you don't have enough dentists carrying out the work, people are going to be paying over those prices anyway.
A lack of dentists is not something unique to the Isle of Man. In terms of NHS dentistry, look across the water to England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, you find exactly the same situation. It's a general problem. And I think the only way we address that problem is by giving a better atmosphere for dentists to work in, probably a more robust contract, that they understand more and they feel they have greater input into the service they're providing. Because I think at the moment, from speaking to various dentists, and as you can imagine, they've not been shy of coming forward and speaking to me, I think they get the feeling that they have some very good ideas about how to move the NHS service forward, but they're not always being listened to. And I think that is one of the key things that we communicate with the service providers. and we listen to their ideas and not necessarily follow the UK model. We've mentioned several times today what's happening in England, what's happening in Scotland. What I want to see is a model of what's happening in the Isle of Man and what can we do to move the Isle of Man service forward. And I think one of the important things is that we engage with the providers and come up with a system that works over here. Now, that's not going to be something we're going to be able to do overnight. If I could wave a magic wand and suddenly fix the problems and get the waiting lists for dental treatment down, I'd do it right now. But realistically, I can't. What we've got to do is move step by step, working with the providers to provide a service that meets the needs of those now and in the future. And I think the only way we are going to be able to do that is by engaging with those providers. And part of this, obviously, the charges have gone up, but that is one small step in the process.
And interestingly, there was a recent Freedom of Information request relating to dentistry and the UDA, and
the UDAs.
Question 6 out of the Freedom of Information was about clawback, getting money back off dental practices who haven't fulfilled their targets. No money has been clawed back from any practice. I don't know if it works the same way with GPs in terms of what they're given and how many patients they see. Are there any plans in this to give the department a mechanism for actually getting that money back if targets aren't fulfilled?
I think what we need to look at is the way that UDAs are paid. At the moment, they're paid upfront on an annual basis, and that is the amount that the surgery has. I've spoken to several dental practitioners who've given me ideas and said that they personally think maybe the UDAs should be paid on a quarterly basis. Maybe they should only be paid for the work that's been completed, or you pay quarterly, so you split the amount of UDAs that they have over 12 months by 4. At the end of each quarter, if a full quarter's UDAs haven't been completed, then there's a clawback element at that point on the next quarter's UDAs. There's various mechanisms. Everything needs to be looked at by the department in terms of how we are delivering dental treatment. I know that the department is planning on engaging later this month with dental practitioners around the contracts that they have and the way that we deliver the service. And I think it's important that we both work together to change it. But certainly there has been issues in the past about clawing back the funds, and that is something that I'm very keen to see resolved, because at the end of the day these are very precious taxpayers' funds being pumped into something that is supposed to be providing for patients, and if it's not providing the patient care that it's required to, then there's something fundamentally wrong and it needs to be fixed.
Moving on to eye tests, the notion of charging for eye tests has been put to one side, but you are going to biennial ones, so once every 2 years rather than annual as they are at the moment. That, you say, is in line with the eye care strategy that's been published, which has been broadly welcomed by that sector. Do you see any opposition to it coming forth?
I think that there's always been people concerned that by moving to a biennial eye test, of saying, well, what about those with potentially developing chronic conditions? Are they going to be missed? Is something going to be missed and something going to go tragically wrong for those individuals? That was a query I raised myself. Obviously, I'm no eye care specialist, so I had to ask the question. And the answer that I've got back is that the likelihood, it would be very unlikely for anything like that to happen, because you would expect people who have any form of deteriorating eyesight to be looking to go to the opticians anyway, and their general opticians would pick up on any problems and then refer them on anyway, outside of the biennial test.
And in terms of any medical procedures, are there any intentions to increase charges to residents?
At the moment, no. There's nothing on the table at the moment. I had a Twitter exchange with a couple of people the other day, and it was probably the shortest Twitter exchange I've ever had, where someone asked, is this a front for further charges down the line? And it most certainly isn't. The point of the Charter is to get into operation the National Health and Care Act of 2016 that requires a scheme to come forward before the Act can be properly activated. And I think one of the other things that seems to be being missed, because the big debate has been around prescription charges, charges for this, charges for that, charges for the other. The Charter itself is absolutely fundamental, because it's the first time really that the department has turned round and actually put into regulation what we say we will deliver and how we are going to deliver it as well. Now that's a very, very big change to how things were done before. It's, in many ways, it's a strategy within regulation, and it also provides, of course, for a proper independent complaints process as well, which I think in the past has been slightly lacking. And so, unfortunately, with everyone wanting to discuss what they see as the meaty issues about prescription charges and everything else, the Charter itself seems to have got a bit lost in the mix. So I think it's very important that we do also remember that what we're doing with the Charter is quite unique for us here on the island, and it is the department laying out what services and what standard of services it needs to provide to the people of the island.
Now, we'll come back onto the Charter in a second, but you've reassessed off-island treatment in terms of travel and accommodation. What changes are there going to be there? Presumably, since you're looking at budgets, there's going to be a narrowing of how much you're willing to pay for travel and accommodation for people who are undergoing off-island treatment.
I think what's important is that we look at the whole picture of off-island treatment. So not just about what allowances are in place, but as I've said again frequently, I think one of the important things with patient transfer is that we assess, do people really need to travel at all? And I know there is a piece of work at the moment within the department ongoing around that. So it's not just about the allowances. We need to look at, are we sending people to the right place at the right time? And is there better ways that a particular service could be delivered on Ireland? The point of that review is that I think it'll be a mixture that comes back. There'll be some things where they say there's certain treatments where people need to go to the UK that aren't currently. And then there's some where they say, well, no, there's certain things we can do better on Ireland. My point is I'm keen on minimising the amount of travel that people have to do, particularly for what I term face-to-face consultations, where people go over, they don't get examined. I've heard from constituents of cases where they go over, they spend hours on an hour on a flight, they then spend several hours in a hospital waiting. They walk in, they speak to a consultant. The consultant doesn't examine them, they just chat how they are. Out they go again, spend more hours in a hospital, and then spend more hours on a plane. Now, to my mind, that's something that can be done via video link, teleconference, Skype, all sorts of things, rather than actually putting it over. So I think in terms of accommodation and people's overnight stays, we should be, wherever possible, looking to minimise that and to minimise the inconvenience. Lots of the patients that we do transfer over to the UK can be quite elderly patients, and it is a very upsetting experience for them to have to travel to receive treatment. So if we can minimise that upset and anything that we feel we can do on Ireland, that's the place to be doing it.
And another aspect which could be a fairly thorny issue is defining what constitutes a visitor to the island, and therefore who should be subject to charges for treatment. You say you're clarifying that. What are the criteria for being classified as a visitor?
I think in the past it's been very, very blurred. Basically, if you are a UK citizen, then obviously there's a reciprocal agreement in place that allows us to receive treatment in the UK and allows them to receive. But there has, unfortunately, I think, sometimes been a bit of abuse in the system around people bringing in family members, etc., into the island to receive treatment. What we've done with the overseas visitors is we are basically turning around and clarifying in terms of immigration and people coming into the island what an overseas visitor is. Questions were obviously asked not long ago in the House of Keys by, I think it was Miss Edge of me, in terms of who can register at GP's surgeries, when are they classed as a visitor, when aren't they? And one of the things that I think came clear from the answer I gave was, at that point in time, GPs would register someone as overseas. They wouldn't necessarily refer them into acute care, and if they did, they'd have to be charged for it. So, but I think, again, we've got to be very, very clear. If someone is resident on the island, then obviously they're a resident. If they are within the UK, then they are a UK citizen, and they fall under the reciprocal health agreement. But then when you're going further afield with people coming in and using the services, we need to be quite clear that they will be charged for those services. And like I say, in the past, I think it's been a very, very grey area. I don't think it's ever going to be one of those areas, I'll be bluntly honest, where you're going to get 100% clarity, because there's always going to be someone who manages to fall between the fences. But I think what we can do is we've got to ensure that we are protecting the budget of the NHS and that people aren't coming here to receive treatment simply because they know here they'll get it free, whereas in their own country they won't. They'd be paying for it, and it's absolutely important that we prevent that from happening.
And under this scheme, the department essentially reserves the right to patch somebody up and send them on their way to be treated back from whence they came.
Yeah.
Who would make that decision?
Oh, obviously it would be a clinical decision. It would have to be a clinical decision. We're certainly not in the remit of having accountants deciding on people's medical treatment. The whole point of the NHS is we are there to provide at the first stage medical treatment for anyone in need. So if you're an overseas visitor, it's not going to be the equivalent of America, where you're, you've checked your credit balance before you receive treatment of any kind. People will still receive treatment at the first point, but once they are in a position that it's safe and healthy, and being assessed by a clinician that it's safe and healthy for them to travel home, then that is where the treatment should stop, and any further treatment should be received in their home jurisdiction.
There is a provision for, I suppose, clawing back money from the insurer if they are insured.
Yes, there is, and obviously that is sensible. And I always urge everyone, if they are travelling either abroad or any overseas visitors coming into the UK, into the island, obviously travel and health insurance is quite important.
Now, if we move on to the Charter, it focuses on the responsibility of the public to look after themselves. You talk about well-being. To what degree are the public going to be left to their own devices to look after their own health?
Well, to be fair, that's one of the focuses. It's not the focus. We're not turning around with the Charter and saying, oh, well, you need to make sure you're okay and we're not really going to do anything. It's one of the focuses. What it's laying out is exactly what I've talked about several times, about moving from an illness service to being a well-being service. One thing I think we have done very well over the years is acting as an illness service, of waiting for someone to get ill and then turning around and saying, right, now we'll treat you. And we'll look after you and then pump you back out of the system. What we need to be doing is looking at helping people who have got the signs of becoming ill, early intervention, but we say that people have a duty as well to look after their own health and not do things that necessarily are going to put them into a situation where they're going to become chronically ill. But there's help and support available to help people with that. And one of the things the Charter is very, very keen on doing, and I think it's an absolutely wonderful document from this point of view, is it's looking at the entire individual. So we're not just talking about physical health here, we're also talking about mental health. And as far as I can recall, and if anyone can produce a document, otherwise I'd be amazed because I've had a look and I can't find one. This is the first Isle of Man government document issued where it makes the link between physical health and mental health and doesn't box them off separately and say, well, that's physical health over there, that's mental health over there. They both interlinked within an individual, and I think that it's excellent the Charter recognises that and says it's the well-being of the whole individual. So there's three strands to it. There's physical health, there's mental health, and then there's your personal health, and taking responsibility for that.
And it also says it'll involve patients in their own care. Now, is this taking an interest in the notes, discussing treatment options? To what extent would you involve an individual in their own care? I
think it's important that people understand what's happened to them and what needs to happen to them to make them better, and also to keep them well on an ongoing basis. I'm not certain in the past that's always been a very successful process. There is always a rush if obviously there's an acute situation with someone to get them treated, get them well. And let's be perfectly honest, there's an awful lot of interesting words in medical terms, lots of phrases bandied around, and sometimes people don't like to say they don't understand what the doctor's saying to them, or understand what their condition actually means. So I think what the Charter is trying to do is it's trying to say it's important that we engage with patients, that they understand what is wrong with them and they understand the steps that need to be taken to make them well and then also to keep them well. And it's about communication. Again, it's not about having someone into, say, through the hospital doors saying, right, you're ill, we'll get you better, thank you very much, you're better now, out you pop, and we wave them off. It's about ensuring there's a proper process where people can understand their own health needs and can be engaged in that process and ask questions. Because I know of people who have had illnesses where they haven't quite understood what's wrong with them, they haven't quite understood where they go next in the process, and it has caused them serious upset, sat there worrying about what is the future of my health. So I think it's very important that there is honest and frank conversations with people, and that at each stage we do engage with the patient and make sure they understand why they're receiving a treatment and what the next step is, not just what's happening to them now, but what happens to them next.
Now, if we go right back to the beginning of the interview and go back to the likes of prescription charges, which links in with the Charter and people taking responsibility for themselves to a degree, in the consultation, the responses to the consultation, a lot of people came back. There was quite a strong support for people who are exempt being able to pay if they had the ability to do so. And this scheme will allow people to do that. Is that exclusive to prescription charges, or would that be across the board with charges?
It allows for anyone to pay a charge if they so wish, if they hold an exemption. So it's not just prescription charges, it's across all charges. And I think that's very, very important, because one of the things I personally always found quite ludicrous, and I had at least several constituents who came up to me and said, well, we have the ability to pay, we're lucky we can pay for this, but because we've either hit the age criteria or we fall under one of the other categories, we've got an exemption. And I had one constituent who did actually go up and try to pay, and they said, oh, no, we can't take the money off you because you meet the exemption criteria. So it's crazy at a time when we're talking about, about NHS funding and wanting to ensure that we have the right funding model in place, where you've got a situation where someone says, I want to pay for that service, and we're saying, no, you must have it free. That, to my mind, is not logical, and I think a common sense approach has been taken where we've stated quite clearly and categorically, if someone wants to pay, they may not have to pay, but if they want to pay, they can do so.
Because the example that is often cited certainly in relation to prescription charges is pensioners who are possibly comfortably well off but are exempt by virtue of age.
I mean, as I've always said, I would quite happily in the future like to see it go towards a means testing system, but obviously that takes time to design and to get in place. I've not changed in my view on that, and I doubt I ever will. But in terms of that, that's exactly an example, and in fact the example I gave from one constituent was exactly that. They'd hit the age exemption, but they felt that they were still in an ability to pay. They tried to pay and were told, no, you must have it free. So I think it's a very common sense approach that's been taken. It's just unfortunate we do actually have to state it for it to happen.
And looking at the review that's going to be carried out, it's already started, how does this scheme and this charter run in tandem with that? Can you see any problems with rolling this out at the time the review's being carried out?
No, it's an holistic review. So what Sir Jonathan is undertaking is a review of the overall health services. I can't see the review delving down into whether we're charging £5 or £3.85 for prescriptions. In fact, I'd be a bit worried if the review did start delving down into that sort of detail. It's looking at the big picture. It's looking at the services we deliver, how we deliver the services, and then the funding model. This is vitally important, to get the charter in place, because that, like I say, activates the National Health and Care Act of 2016, which allows various provisions in there to state what services the department should be delivering and how they should be delivering those services. And like I say, again, an absolutely fundamental one that I think has been lost in the whole debate because of, unfortunately, the original consultation and the proposals that went out, is the fact it also puts in place a proper, robust, independent complaints mechanism that wasn't there previously.
Catherine Nicholl was talking to the Minister for Health and Social Care, David Ashcroft, about the proposal for changes to charges and other aspects of the health service. The National Health and Care Service General Scheme 2018 goes before Tynwald for approval on the 18th of April, and it's item 5 on the order paper. A full debate may be heard live on Manx Radio that morning. If you'd like to hear the earlier conversation I had with the Minister, which was on the 18th of March, it can be found in two places on Manx Radio's website. It's in the portal section under Sunday Opinion and the Man in Line. The Isle of Man in Victorian Times is next, after the break. And welcome back to Sunday Opinion. If we go back in Manx history to the 1790s, a new source of income had started. The island was seen as a cheaper place to live for half-pay officers and also a safe haven against off-island creditors. Well, this was all changed in 1814, apparently causing distress, particularly in Douglas, as many long-term residents left. The Duke of Atholl saw the summer visitor as a replacement, for which he had purpose-built Strathallan Crescent for letting during the summer season. However, it was the introduction of steamships between Liverpool and Douglas that provided a reliable and efficient mechanism to move visitors. Post-1880, the mass tourist industry was driven mostly by the Lancashire cotton towns with their 1 week's wakes holiday. The actual season was compressed into some 10 to 12 weeks of intense activity, and it hadn't changed all that much after the Second World War. I can recall as a boy in the 40s and 50s my father, who had shops in Douglas, saying to me, "If we don't make our money between the start of June and the start of September, we won't have any for the winter." So what did all these people do when they were here? What accommodation and entertainment was available, and where did the money come from to construct for the burgeoning holiday businesses, the hotels, dance halls, trams, trains, parks, theatres and shows and so on? The list is almost endless. How much of that infrastructure remains today? What value is it in the 21st century? And how do we look after these facilities and buildings from the past? Do we need to? To explore this and other aspects of Victoriana and Victorian history in the Isle of Man, we welcome today's studio guest from the Isle of Man Victorian Society, Peter Kelly, MBE. Thanks for joining us this morning, Peter.
That's all right. I don't think you need me with that introduction. You've done a lot of work there, so you may as well carry on with the programme.
Yes, all right. It's not meant to be a one-man band, you see. So.
Right.
Yes, but that's the first part of it, Peter. But the question that I raised there still remains. It's 1800s on with the shipping. Obviously, this wasn't the steam packet company on its own then at that time?
No. I mean, the steam packet played a great part from 1830. But later on, you see, with the different railways, North West Railways, etc., in England, some of the railway companies had their own ships. Right. And I think the Fleetwood run was principally through one of these railway companies. Promotion of the island was indeed through the railways. The steam packet, we've probably all seen in the past those models of absolute incredible models of a steam packet boat in a glass case, 8 foot long, etc. I think they still have a couple in imperial buildings. But they were on the railway stations, they were on the platforms, and that served as the advert, and then the posters went up. And this is before the tourist board, this is before the publicity board. It was the steam packet who were generating business for themselves that created the tourist industry coming in. And of course those railway companies who had their own ships which came in, they too they offered a package deal, didn't they? Your railway fare and your steam and your boat fare all in one, in order to encourage people and increase their business and profit.
It must have worked for them, of course, because when you look at some of the numbers going back to, there's one period in the 1940s, but if you go back to the other periods, at one time there was 600,000 visitors or more in 1 year. That's a phenomenal figure.
Yeah, that was either 1913 or 14. Yes, well, there's a lot in the news at the moment about visitor figures and arrivals, and one does wonder. Steve Carter told me many years ago that the figures for arrivals at Douglas was a little bit misleading. You see, somehow they counted everyone that came off the boat, whether there was somebody there going 1, 2, 3 or whatever, I don't know. But if you were here and you took one of the many boats from Douglas to Port Sodrick and then you came back in the afternoon, you were an arrival at Douglas. So that's what Steve reckoned anyway, so one does wonder with some of these figures. But yes, they were great. And you immediately ask, well, where did they all stay? Well, you've got to bear in mind that so many houses, particularly in Douglas and in Onken, that were just normal family houses, would take in visitors, usually on the sort of lodging way where the visitor came, and when they were out for the day they came back with a piece of ham and some eggs or something, and the owner of the house cooked it for them. So they were charging money for the bed, but provided the service of the food without the cost.
Well, my grandmother did that, actually. I can still recall her trying to cook 3 different meals on one little gas cooker.
Yes.
But she provided the potatoes and vegetables, I think.
Ah, right. Okay.
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
but the accommodation, in essence, in itself, if you look at the shorefront in Douglas, a lot of which is gone now, but from what used to be the Villiers Corner right the way through, and along the other side of the prom, that was all built over a relatively short period of time, wasn't it?
Well, the Loch Promenade was more or less complete in 1875, and the plots were sold off. They weren't built as terraces. I mean, they were in terrace blocks, but you bought your plot and then you started. So you could have a section where there was 2 houses, then a gap for the equivalent of 3, and then another 2 or 3, and so on.
Like at Ramsey.
Yeah, and it, the gaps filled very quickly. That was a big change, the creation of Loch Promenade, because there you had purpose-built. Now, before, when people came, there were inns where you could stay in Douglas, pretty grotty sort of places, really, but this was the first purpose-built. And what was incredible is that on every landing there was a toilet. Now, in other places, you would be lucky if there was one in the whole building, or if, in fact, you didn't have to go out to the yard to the Thigh Egg. So the creation of Loch Promenade in the late 1870s made a big change. You were also, prior to that, having Mona Street, Christian Road, Albert Street built, initially as private houses, but there was a delay with Christian Road being developed, so when that got going, they were built with big outlets and 3 or 4 stories high. They were built for tourists or visitors, as we used to call them.
So as you went up the town, the cost of the room became less, did it?
Absolute. Although there are those that claim to have a sea view, but you did have the walk up the hill, which is, of course, what brought about the cable car, which would take people uptown. Right. For tuppence up and a penny down.
But all of this accommodation, I suppose, when you look at large numbers, I mean, we've talked about the biggest one, about 600 and odd thousand, but 400 and odd thousand was quite common. But it looks as if in those arrival figures, they weren't all staying visitors. There was a huge day trip business at the time.
Absolute, yeah. I mean, we had day trips from Belfast, we had day trips from Dublin, but equally we had the reverse, that you could go from here to Dublin for the day, and that boat that brought them sort of took you back and so on. Yeah, there was a big influx. Usually they got in at 1 o'clock, and you would just see thousands walking up Victoria Street. This is why there were so many eating places in Victoria Street, Wilson's Grill and Silver Grill and all the rest of it. And then they would make their way through Strand Street. And then from Strand Street, it was along the prom and up to White City. And then make their way back in the evening to head back from whence they came. And, yeah, I mean, even into the early 70s, that was still happening. And the trinket shops did very well out of it. Souvenirs.
And the pubs.
And the pubs, oh yes. Well, so I think on the Scottish boats they arrived drunk to start with. Anyway.
Well, there used to be. I was on the board of what was then the Manx Electric Railways Board for some time, and it was interesting looking through the old records because they always reckoned the best days for passenger transport were wet ones.
Well, it would be. Yeah. Yes, it would be, and. Of course, if you were staying longer, with a day trip, you're unlikely to jump on electric tram and go to Ramsey, unless you had relatives there or something. But no, for visitors staying a week, yes, they would head to Laxey, they would head to Ramsey. Otherwise, they would be on the shore at Douglas.
With the corporation's deck chairs making some money.
Yes.
But looking at all this development, you talked about Loch Promenade, and there were all sorts of other places built. Derby Castle, the Palace Ballroom, which was an enormous thing in its day, and the cinemas came along a little bit later, perhaps, just after maybe in the Edwardian era it started. Swimming baths, Perio shows, a huge investment, whichever way you look at it. Where did the money come from? It couldn't have been self-generated, could it?
No. Well, take, for instance, the Grand Hotel complex at the bottom of Victoria Street. That was a scheme promoted, which was to incorporate a hotel, a theatre, swimming baths, music hall, shops, temperance hotel, and the money for that was raised off island. There was a company formed, the Douglas Baths and Aquarium Limited in Manchester. You had one of the councillors from Manchester. He may have ended up as mayor at one time. They promoted it, and people in Lancashire who'd come here on holiday, oh yes, we'll make money in the Isle of Man, and the investors were in many cases from Lancashire. Some cases it flourished, others it didn't. The bath scheme fell asunder. They used up all the capital on just building the baths without the hotel and the music halls. Then along comes Mr. Lightfoot, and he buys it off them, and he creates it. The Palace and Derby Castle Company. You know, there were lists of shareholders produced each year, and whilst there were local people with 5 shares, you'll find the biggest shareholders were in fact off island. But it was those who saw the potential that put the money in. And the hotels on Loch Promenade quite often were built by entrepreneurial local builders who then let them. They didn't run them. They got an income through the rental. And quite often those who rented them were again from Lancashire landladies, and they would name their houses after the place they came from, Radcliffe or, other place, Manchester House and things like that.
But didn't the actual Manx people who went away to the mining and the diamond industry, they put some money in it as well, didn't they? When they came back?
In particular, the Diamond King, Joseph Mulcreast, he had an affinity for his hometown in Peel, and the Marine Terraces at Marine Parade over the far end where the swimming baths were, those houses there, he primed the pump by building the first ones in order to create an industry, employment for the local people, and not just those running the hotel, but the shopkeepers, the baker and so on, who would all have some sort of spin-off.
Well, maybe we can explore this a little further afterwards, because some of the Victorian infrastructure is well gone now, but some of it still exists in one form or another. It's quite surprising how actually some of them have lasted.
Yes.
So maybe we could explore that, because I gather you're staying on for the Manor line, so we will talk a little. We've got 1 or 2 texts and emails come in, but we'll take telephone calls as well on the subject. So we'll continue, because I'd like to continue as well about how we treat Victorian architecture and assets today, as opposed to what happened in the past. But there we must end this part, this Sunday Opinion.